the sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Wyoming Territory, where dust devils danced across the barren landscape like ghosts of forgotten dreams. It was 1887, and the frontier still held secrets that civilized men weren't meant to uncover. Samuel Morrison had ridden 3 days straight from Cheyenne, following a lead that seemed too good to be true, a ranch selling for just $1. The previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances, and the locals whispered about strange sounds echoing from the property at night. But Samuel was a practical man, a former Union soldier who'd seen enough real horrors during the war to dismiss superstitions. What he didn't know was that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The Morrison Ranch sat like a wounded animal against the horizon, its weathered buildings casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun. The main house sagged under the weight of neglect, its windows dark as dead eyes, staring out at the endless prairie. Samuel dismounted his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Clara, and approached the front porch with measured steps. The floorboards groaned under his boots, each sound echoing through the stillness like a funeral bell. He reached for the brass door handle, noting how it turned far too easily, as if someone had been expecting him. The interior of the house was a tomb of dust and decay. Furniture covered in white sheets that looked disturbingly like shrouds in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. Samuel called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence, but received no answer except the settling of old wood and the whisper of wind through broken shutters. As he explored the ground floor, Samuel found evidence of the previous owner's final days scattered throughout the rooms. Jeremiah Blackwood had been a recluse, according to the lawyer who'd handled the sale, a man who'd lived alone on the property for over 20 years without so much as a hired hand to help with the cattle. Empty whiskey bottles lined the kitchen, counter like soldiers, and playing cards lay scattered across a table as if someone had abandoned a game mid-hand. The air inside the house carried a strange sweetness, like flowers left too long in water, mixed with something else Samuel couldn't quite identify, something that made his skin crawl and his instincts scream warnings he chose to ignore. It was when he climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor that Samuel first heard it, a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere above his head. He paused on the landing, hand resting on the grip of his Colt revolver, listening intently. The sound came again, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones, repeated over and over like a coded message. Samuel had spent enough time in frontier towns to recognize the sound of someone trying to communicate through walls or floors. But the real estate agent had assured him the property was completely vacant. He followed the sound down a narrow hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, whose eyes seemed to track his movement through the gloom. The tapping grew louder as Samuel approached a door at the end of the hall, its surface scarred by what looked like claw marks, gouged deep into the wood. The brass nameplate read Elizabeth in faded script, and beneath it, someone had carved the words, "She waits with a knife or some other sharp instrument." Samuel's military training had taught him to assess threats methodically, but standing before that door, he felt something primal and ancient stirring in his gut. The same instinct that had kept him alive during cavalry charges and midnight raids. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums like cotton. He reached for the door handle, noting how cold the brass felt despite the stifling heat that had built up in the upper floor of the house. The door swung open without resistance, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed according to the property maps he'd studied. Where the blueprints showed an exterior wall, Samuel found himself looking into a space that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the house, its dimensions impossible and disorienting. The room was furnished like a young woman's bedroom from decades past, complete with a canopy bed draped in Mothitton lace and a vanity table covered with bottles of perfume that had long since turned to colored sludge. But it was the figure sitting at that vanity that made Samuel's blood turn to ice water in his veins. She appeared to be no more than 16 or 17 years old, with long auburn hair that caught light from sources Samuel couldn't identify. Her dress was the pale blue of a summer sky, pristine and beautiful despite the decay that had claimed everything else in the house. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring into the cracked mirror of the vanity as if seeing something there that existed beyond the physical world. Samuel called out to her, his voice barely above a whisper, but she gave no indication that she'd heard him. When he took a step into the room, the floorboards didn't creak. In fact, his boots made no sound at all against what should have been aged pine planks. The air in the room was different too, cleaner and cooler, carrying the scent of wildflowers and something else he remembered from his childhood in Ohio, the smell of his mother's rose garden after a spring rain. The girl's reflection in the mirror was wrong, showing not her face but a swirling darkness that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Samuel had seen death in many forms during his years as a soldier, but this was something else entirely. Something that violated the natural order in ways that made his rational mind rebel against what his eyes were telling him. He spoke again, louder this time, asking who she was and how she'd come to be in the house. But she remained motionless as a painted statue, It was only when Samuel reached out to touch her shoulder that Elizabeth finally turned to face him, and he saw that her eyes were the color of winter storms, gray and turbulent and filled with a sadness so profound it seemed to drain the warmth from the room. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades, though her face remained that of a young woman barely out of childhood. She told him her name was Elizabeth Blackwood, daughter of the man who'd built the ranch, and that she'd been waiting in that room for 23 years, ever since the night her father had locked her away from a world that had grown too dangerous for a girl who saw things others couldn't see. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words, remembering the stories he'd heard in town about Jeremiah Blackwood's mysterious past, and the tragedy that had supposedly claimed his family decades earlier. According to local legend, Blackwood had lost his wife and daughter in a fire that had consumed the original ranch house, driving him to rebuild on the same cursed ground where his family had perished. But the woman sitting before Samuel was very much alive, her presence in the room as real as his own, though everything about the situation defied logical explanation. She explained that her father had discovered her gift when she was just 14, the ability to see beyond the veil that separated the world of the living from whatever lay beyond death's threshold. Elizabeth's story unfolded like pages from a book written in blood and shadow, each revelation more disturbing than the last. She told Samuel how her father had initially tried to suppress her abilities through prayer and isolation, believing that her visions were the work of the devil. But as her powers grew stronger, so did the things that were drawn to her from the other side that whispered promises of knowledge and power in exchange for passage into the world of the living. Jeremiah Blackwood had been a God-fearing man, but he was also a practical frontiersman who understood that some threats couldn't be fought with bullets or brute force. When the entities began manifesting physically around his daughter, causing livestock to sicken and die, crops to wither in the fields, and strange lights to dance across the prairie at night, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He built the impossible room, using construction techniques and materials that seemed to bend the laws of physics, creating a space that existed partially outside normal reality, a prison, designed to contain not just his daughter, but the supernatural forces that sought to use her as a conduit into the mortal world. For 23 years, Elizabeth had remained in that room, aging slowly or perhaps not at all, sustained by forces that Samuel couldn't begin to comprehend. Her father had visited her daily, bringing food and news of the outside world, though she claimed to need neither sustenance nor information to survive in her otherworldly captivity. The ranch's isolation had served Jeremiah Blackwood's purpose as well, keeping curious neighbors and potential witnesses at a distance while he grappled with the terrible burden of protecting both his daughter and the world from her dangerous gift. Samuel learned that the mysterious circumstances surrounding Blackwood's death weren't so mysterious after all. The old man had simply reached the end of his strength, worn down by decades of serving as guardian to forces beyond human understanding. On his deathbed, Blackwood had arranged for the ranch to be sold for a nominal fee to someone who might be strong enough to take over his responsibilities, though he'd been careful not to reveal the true nature of what that responsibility entailed. The lawyer who'd handled the sale knew nothing of Elizabeth's existence, having been told only that the property came with certain unusual conditions that the new owner would discover in due time. Samuel realized he'd been specifically chosen for this burden, his military background and reputation for reliability making him an ideal candidate in Blackwood's estimation. But understanding the situation and accepting it were two entirely different matters, and Samuel found himself torn between his desire to help the young woman and his instinct to flee from something so fundamentally wrong. Elizabeth seemed to sense his internal struggle, explaining that she bore no malice toward him or anyone else, but that her continued existence posed a constant threat to the barrier between worlds. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the Wyoming landscape, Samuel found himself faced with a choice that would define the rest of his life. Elizabeth had made it clear that she couldn't leave the room without triggering catastrophic consequences. The entities she'd been holding at bay for over 2 decades would be free to enter the physical world, bringing with them horrors that frontier towns like Cheyenne were utterly unprepared to face. But keeping her in prison felt like a betrayal of everything Samuel believed about justice and human dignity, even if she claimed to accept her fate willingly. The practical part of his mind, honed by years of military service, recognized that he was completely out of his depth in dealing with supernatural forces. But his conscience rebelled against the idea of walking away from someone who'd already suffered so much. Elizabeth told him about the loneliness of her captivity. The years of watching seasons change through her window while the world beyond her room continued its march toward modernity. She'd witnessed the arrival of the railroad, the gradual taming of the wild frontier, and the slow transformation of the American West from a land of opportunity into something more civilized and constrained. Through it all, she'd remained frozen in time, a living ghost haunting a space that existed at the intersection of multiple realities. Samuel asked her what she wanted from him, what she hoped he might be able to do that her father hadn't already tried. But her answer revealed the true depth of her tragedy. Elizabeth explained that her father had spent decades searching for a way to break the supernatural bonds that tied her to the otherworldly entities, consulting with medicine men, traveling scholars, and anyone else who might possess knowledge of such matters. He'd tried everything from Native American purification rituals to complex European exorcism ceremonies. But nothing had succeeded in severing the connection between his daughter and the forces that sought to use her as a gateway. The room itself had become a kind of mystical anchor, holding Elizabeth in a state of suspended existence that prevented her from either fully living or properly dying. She told Samuel that she'd long ago accepted that her situation was likely permanent, but she'd never stopped hoping that someone might eventually find a way to end her suffering without unleashing hell on earth. Her father's death had filled her with a new kind of despair, the fear that she might remain trapped in that impossible room forever, forgotten by a world that had never truly known she existed. Samuel's arrival represented the first genuine human contact she'd experienced in months, and despite the supernatural circumstances of their meeting, she found herself clinging to the hope that he might succeed where her father had failed. But she also warned him about the price of involvement, explaining how her father had aged decades in just a few years after beginning his vigil, worn down by the constant spiritual and emotional strain of containing forces beyond human comprehension. The conversation stretched deep into the night as Samuel learned more about the entities that Elizabeth held at bay through her continued imprisonment. She described them as beings of pure malevolence and hunger, creatures that had once walked the earth in physical form but had been banished to a realm of shadows and whispers by ancient powers now lost to human memory. They craved return to the material world with an intensity that transcended human understanding, and they'd identified Elizabeth as their most promising conduit for achieving that goal. Her psychic abilities had marked her as a beacon in their dark realm, drawing their attention like moths to a flame, and once they'd focused on her, there was no way to make them lose interest. The entities fed on fear, despair, and spiritual energy, which meant that Elizabeth's prolonged captivity actually sustained them. In their efforts to breach the barriers between worlds, it was a delicate balance keeping her isolated enough to prevent their full manifestation while ensuring she remained strong enough to maintain the psychic barriers that held them back. Samuel began to understand the impossible position that Jeremiah Blackwood had found himself in, forced to become both his daughter's protector and her jailer in order to prevent a catastrophe that could affect thousands of innocent people. The weight of that responsibility had ultimately killed the old man, and now it was being passed to Samuel whether he wanted it or not. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel made his decision. He couldn't abandon Elizabeth to face eternity alone in her supernatural prison, but he also couldn't ignore the potential consequences of making the wrong choice. He would stay at the ranch and learn everything he could about maintaining the barriers that kept the entities at bay, at least until he could find a more permanent solution to the problem. Elizabeth's relief was palpable when he told her of his decision, though she continued to warn him about the personal costs of becoming her guardian. She explained that the entities would test him constantly, attempting to wear down his resolve through nightmares, hallucinations, and psychological attacks designed to drive him to madness or despair. The ranch itself would become a battleground between the forces of light and darkness, with Samuel serving as the primary defender of a barrier that existed as much in his mind as in physical reality. He would need to maintain absolute mental discipline, avoiding alcohol or anything else that might weaken his psychic defenses, while also learning to recognize the signs of supernatural incursion that might require immediate action. The isolation would be nearly as challenging as the supernatural threats, as Samuel would need to keep the ranch's true purpose secret from neighbors and visitors, who might inadvertently disrupt the delicate balance he was trying to maintain. Over the following weeks, Samuel began his education in the occult arts under Elizabeth's guidance, learning techniques for recognizing and repelling supernatural entities that his military training had never prepared him for. She taught him to read the signs in nature that indicated otherworldly activity, the way animals behaved differently when the barriers were weakening, how the quality of light changed when entities were attempting to manifest, and the subtle shifts in temperature and atmospheric pressure that preceded supernatural events. Samuel discovered that his military experience was actually more useful than he'd initially realized, as the discipline and mental toughness he'd developed during the war served him well in resisting the psychological attacks of the entities. Elizabeth showed him how to reinforce the mystical protections around her room using techniques her father had learned from various sources over the years, combining elements of Christian mysticism with Native American spiritual practices and even some methods derived from European folklore. The work was exhausting and sometimes terrifying, as Samuel found himself confronting forces that challenged his understanding of reality itself, but he was sustained by his growing sense of purpose and his deepening connection with the remarkable young woman he'd pledged to protect. Elizabeth's intelligence and strength impressed him daily, as she demonstrated an understanding of supernatural forces that rivaled that of trained scholars while maintaining her humanity despite decades of isolation. Samuel's transformation from practical frontiersman to guardian of mystical secrets was gradual but profound, changing not just his daily routines but his fundamental understanding of the world around him. He learned to sleep lightly and wake instantly at the first sign of supernatural disturbance, developing an almost supernatural awareness of the ebb and flow of otherworldly energies that surrounded the ranch. His relationship with Elizabeth deepened beyond the simple guardian-prisoner dynamic he'd initially expected, evolving into something closer to a partnership as she shared her knowledge and he provided the human contact she'd been denied for so long. They spent hours talking about everything from philosophy to practical matters of ranch management, with Elizabeth demonstrating a sharp wit and broad knowledge that made Samuel realize how much intellectual stimulation she'd been denied during her captivity. Her father had been a simple man with limited education, unable to engage with his daughter's quick mind in ways that might have made her imprisonment more bearable. But Samuel's broader experiences and military education allowed him to offer her the kind of mental companionship she'd been craving for decades. In return, she taught him to see the world through different eyes, pointing out patterns and connections he'd never noticed before, helping him understand that reality was far more complex and mysterious than he'd ever imagined. The entities didn't remain passive during Samuel's education period, launching increasingly aggressive attempts to weaken the barriers that contained them or to corrupt Samuel's mind through subtle psychological manipulation. He experienced nightmares of unprecedented vividness and terror, dreams that seemed to continue even after he'd awakened, leaving him unsure of what was real and what was supernatural influence. Sometimes he would wake to find his room rearranged in impossible ways, or discover that hours had passed without his awareness, suggesting that the entities were capable of affecting his perception of time and reality. Elizabeth helped him understand these attacks as tests of his resolve, teaching him techniques for distinguishing between genuine experience and supernatural deception. But the constant vigilance required was mentally and physically exhausting. Samuel found himself losing weight despite eating regularly, his hair beginning to show premature gray streaks, and his hands developing a slight tremor that hadn't been there before he'd opened the door to Elizabeth's room. He began to understand how the burden had aged Jeremiah Blackwood so rapidly, and he wondered whether he possessed the strength to maintain his vigil for the decades that might be required. Elizabeth sensed his growing doubt and did her best to encourage him, sharing stories of her father's struggles and victories over the years, reminding Samuel that he wasn't facing this challenge alone. The years that followed tested Samuel's resolve in ways he could never have anticipated when he first rode onto the cursed ranch. Winter storms brought intensified supernatural activity, as if the entities drew strength from the darkness and isolation of the Wyoming blizzards. Samuel learned to read the warning signs in Elizabeth's behavior, the way her eyes would grow distant when the barriers weakened, how her voice would take on an otherworldly quality when the entities pressed closest to breakthrough. He developed rituals of protection that became as natural as breathing, walking the perimeter of the house each dawn and dusk, reinforcing the mystical boundaries that kept the ranch from becoming a gateway to hell itself. Elizabeth aged slowly during their time together, perhaps 1 year for every 5 that passed in the outside world, while Samuel bore the full weight of mortal time, accelerated by supernatural stress. His hair turned completely white by his 40th birthday, though his eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had first attracted her father's attention. The isolation that had once seemed unbearable became a kind of sacred solitude, broken only by Elizabeth's presence and the occasional supply run to distant towns, where he was careful to maintain the fiction of being a simple rancher. The bond between them transcended the boundaries of guardian and prisoner, evolving into something deeper than romantic luva. Spiritual connection, forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice and mutual dependence. Elizabeth's gift for seeing beyond the veil allowed her to perceive Samuel's true nature, while his unwavering dedication to her protection revealed depths of character that surprised them both. They never spoke of marriage or conventional relationships, understanding instinctively that their connection existed outside normal human categories. But their devotion to each other became the anchor that held them, both steady against the supernatural storms that raged around them. As Samuel entered his 50s, his body began to show the toll of decades spent battling forces beyond human comprehension. Elizabeth watched with growing concern as the man who had become her salvation slowly sacrificed his own life to maintain her prison. She began to speak more frequently of finding a way to end their vigil permanently, not through escape but through a final confrontation that might seal the entities away forever, even if it meant her own destruction. Samuel resisted these discussions initially, unwilling to consider any solution that might cost Elizabeth her existence. But he gradually came to understand that their current situation was merely postponing an inevitable crisis rather than At the end came not with dramatic supernatural confrontation, but with quiet acceptance of mortality's limits. Samuel collapsed one autumn morning while reinforcing the barriers around Elizabeth's room, his heart finally surrendering to the accumulated stress of his impossible task. Elizabeth held him as he died, her tears falling on his weathered face, as she whispered promises to find someone worthy to continue their work. But even as Samuel drew his last breath, he was smiling, knowing that he had lived a life of profound purpose and had given the woman he loved 27 years of companionship in her eternal prison. In the silence that followed Samuel's passing, Elizabeth felt the barriers around her room beginning to weaken without his constant vigilance to maintain them. The entities pressed closer than they had in decades, sensing opportunity in her grief and isolation. But instead of despair, Elizabeth found herself filled with a strange peace, understanding finally that her long captivity might be nearing its end. She had learned much from watching Samuel's dedication and sacrifice, and she began to formulate a plan that would require all her accumulated strength. And as night fell over the Wyoming ranch, Elizabeth began her preparations for what would either be her liberation or her ultimate sacrifice, knowing that Samuel's spirit would be watching over her as she faced the darkness that had defined her existence for over half a century. The door to her impossible room stood open, just as Samuel had left it, and through it drifted the sound of wind across the prairie, the same wind that had brought him to her all those years ago, carrying with it the promise that even the longest night must eventually give way to dawn.